Now live.
Hi, everyone. People will be coming into the webinar right now. Welcome, welcome. You can put into the chat where you are joining us from. Good evening, good evening. We'll just give it another minute or two while people are coming. Hi, Melvin, welcome. We're so looking forward to this evening. We're here with the esteemed candidates for Manhattan District Attorney. And I want to remind everyone that we are recording this evening's conversation. Welcome, everyone. Rabbi Josh and Pastor Kaji and I are so glad that you're here. We represent, how many did you say today? What's our best guess of how many people that we represent here today?
50,000.
50,000 people. Pretty impressive. So we'll go ahead and get started. I am Reverend Amanda. I'm an executive minister at Middle Collegiate Church in the East Village. And I'm so honored to be one of the partners and hosts of tonight's event, along with Rabbi Josh of East End Temple and Pastor Kaji of Park Avenue Christian. And there are close to 30 faith organizations across the island who have come together to sponsor this because we believe so strongly in the position of the district attorney. And we have so many questions and so many things that we want to be able to be in conversation with you all about tonight. Josh is going to be putting into the chat all of our sponsors of the evening. So take a look in the chat and see all the different faith communities that are represented here. But to our esteemed candidates, we also want to take a moment and just say thank you. We were chatting before the webinar started. You all are tired. You've been campaigning, you've been in conversations, you've been Zooming, you're trying to figure out when to turn your camera off and when to give somebody a hug goodnight. And we just want to say that we see that and we recognize the hard work that you're putting into this campaign. And we thank you so much for doing it. And we look forward to hearing you. So on that note, I'll pass it over to Rabbi Josh.
Good evening, and just a heartfelt word of gratitude to everybody who is here, notably all of the incredible clergy and lay leaders who made this possible, and the countless activists, the countless people who just care deeply about progress and reform who are part of this. I have the privilege of introducing someone who is not only senior pastor at Park Avenue Christian Church, who is not only chair of the New Sanctuary Coalition, who is not only a civic leader, a social leader, a civil rights leader, but in many ways is a rabbi's pastor. She is a teacher, a friend, somebody who I respect deeply from the bottom of my heart. And so without further ado, I get to introduce this evening's host, MC, coordinator, Pastor Kaji Douša.
Well, first, thank you very much, Rabbi Josh, my dear friend, and thank you every other coordinating congregation for what we're doing. And what you'll see is that we are pulling together, not to just force everybody else to be in a box, in a room, but actually to help each of us to think through what we are called to do in the next moment of justice for New York City, and particularly as Manhattan congregations in Manhattan. And I know that many of the people who we have on the call today have visions for that. And we're really excited to hear about that, learn about that, assess it, ask questions of it, start. And we really do consider this time as a start, and to interrogate that, but not in a terrible way, but more in a way that helps you. Who else would you be in conversation with but people who really do have sincere and studied ideas about justice? So anyway, from there, I'm not going to become a preacher and go for longer. What I will do is ask you our main question, which you've received ahead of time. And what I will say is that we're going to ask this question. We'll have a couple more questions after this, and we will be moderating in such a way to really help to bring everybody back to your policy stances rather than platitudes. And many of you, if you don't already, I don't know why, but if you don't, you know me, I'll be sincere and loving, but let's stick with policy, and I will cut in if it doesn't seem like it's there. But anyway, here's the question that I'm going to ask, and each of you know about your time frames, and here it is. What will you do to reduce mass incarceration and racism more generally in the criminal justice system? Thank you so much for your time. God bless you. And oh, wow. And we will start, and I'm just doing this just randomly because did we actually allocate who would go first? So what I'm going to do is just look on my screen, which means that is Dan Quart.
Thank you so much, Pastor, and to the assembled clergy, so many people listening, and to my fellow colleagues and lawyers running in this race. It's good to see everyone. And this is the critical question in this race, at least it is for me. How do we reduce the footprint of this office? And it really involves doing several things specifically: prosecuting less and stop using the tools of this office that have led to the criminalization of people of color. And specifically, that's been my work in Albany for the better part of 10 years. True decarceration, achieving that result of reform in Albany, fighting for bail reform, and fighting against the rollbacks of bail reform. So I think we look at three specific systems. The first, pretrial incarceration. It has such a negative impact on the after effect of the case through prosecution. You ask the Bronx Defenders or any other organizations. And that's why 4 years ago, I wrote legislation that would end cash bail completely, because the connection between one's wealth or lack thereof and their liberty is not only likely unjust, it's probably unconstitutional as well. So end cash bail, and that will have better outcomes for poor people, especially people of color, and reduce the footprint of the office in many ways. Secondly, prosecute less. Significantly reduce what you're prosecuting. And I have a list of crimes and charges that I'll simply decline to prosecute. And that includes possession of drug cases and so many other things. That is on my website. And lastly, something that is truly race-based is the use of conspiracy charges, really to go after communities of color, young people. Under this administration, under Cy Vance, 103 people were taken out of housing complex in central Harlem. And I've spoken out, and I've been in the community with different NYCHA complexes, helping to get people to foil themselves to see if they are on these spreadsheets or lists that are the predicate towards these prosecutions. I simply won't use these tools because they're just another step in stop and frisk policies, and they're certainly disproportionately, if not directly, impacted communities of color. Those are three specific ways I'll go about decarceration and changing the way business is done at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office.
Thank you very much. And I would love to now offer it up to the next person on my screen, which is completely randomized, but thank you very much, Liz Crotty.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for hosting this tonight. I would be remiss to say it's nice to be here with Middle Collegiate Church, where I went to pre-K and nursery school way back early in the 70s. I haven't been in the church in a while. I was there a couple years ago for a family friend's funeral, and the stained glass windows were always a favorite, and I hope they come back strong after the fire. I was very sorry to hear about that. I'm from downtown Manhattan, as I said, and I think we need to talk too about, when we talk about mass incarceration and racial disparities, we also have to talk about public safety. And so I think we start with talking with the lens of public safety. First of all, when it comes to mass incarceration here in New York City, jail rates were as low as they were in World War II. In April, there was 3,000 people in jail. I think we're up to about 5,000, and I think we have to watch it, but I don't think it's mass incarceration. I think that the bigger issue is the racial disparity of those who actually go to jail versus those who don't go to jail. And so I think that distinction is made. I think we have to do, my solution is simple. I think we have to look at the facts of each and every case and how those facts come to light and how do we prosecute. I think when we look at the ways we prosecute and what we prosecute, I do think holding people accountable is a better way to get people to do better. That said, when we prosecute, if we can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, then we have a consideration of whether or not jail is the best solution for this case. So I think if we look on it in an individual basis, we will have a fair result. Also, I'm running to lead an office where the tenet is to do the right thing. And doing the right thing means looking at all the evidence and covering all the evidence, looking at it. These days, it's digital, surveillance camera, body cam footage, DNA, it is voluminous. So we need to look at all the evidence, look at all of the facts, and really make these determinations based on what we know. And once we know that and see how it applies and listen to the victims and listen to the communities where these crimes are happening. And then I think if we look at all of those things, we can make fairer decisions. And that is the district attorney's office that I want to lead. And that's, I think, what leads to a fairer office and ones with least amount of racial disparities. I think we have to talk about it. And I think it can't be the elephant in the room, but we also are tasked with actually prosecuting cases as the district attorney. Now, when we prosecute cases, we also have to look at, there's two things: prosecuting the case and then preventing the case. So I think we have to look at preventing crime and prosecuting crime. And when we look to how to prevent crime, we have to look at investing in communities and what the community is saying and how do we do that. But I think it's a micro, we have to take a micro approach to a macro problem. And then I think by that way, we get fairer results. I look forward to the conversation tonight, and thank you all for having me.
Thank you very, very much. Grateful to hear from you. And now I'd love to turn things over to Tahani Abushi.
Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be back amongst friends, whether it's fighting ICE raids or rallying with our youth for resources and services, or standing in a vigil reaffirming our commitment to peace, equity, and justice with our neighbors. But for those who don't know me yet, my name is Tahani Abushi. I'm a civil rights attorney, and for over a decade, I have fought against discrimination, racism, excessive force by the police, and I've also fought to protect our children from some of the most egregious abuses, especially those of sexual assault. And for me, the fight for criminal justice reform is personal because when I was 14, my father was sentenced to 22 years in prison. And overnight, my mother became a single parent to 10 children. And so I witnessed firsthand the damage and destruction that this system could cause, and how everything we did was a fight to not become a statistic. Because with this system, it's in the business of throwing families away. So for me, running for Manhattan District Attorney, it's important because it's time to really protect our communities and to call out these abuses for what they are and fix them. And so I propose 3 very important policies to shrink the footprint of this office and reduce the racial disparities while ensuring we are putting no badge or bank account above the law. The first, I start with a very comprehensive declination policy. Now, as a civil rights attorney, in my experience, I learned where the loopholes are, how the NYPD interplays with the DA's office, how the courts respond, what our different city agencies interact. And it's important to understand that there are a lot of protections for abuses that happen. And so I've identified specific charges that we would decline, those stemming from social inequities like poverty, mental illness, substance use disorder, homelessness, and mental illness. And what instead we're going to do is partner with our community-based organizations, follow the lead of our community leaders, and ensure people get quality, consistent treatment to help them through their struggles, not knock them when they're down and use them as easy targets. The second thing we're going to do is create an arrest review unit. And this is where we're going to have police accountability. We're not just talking about putting officers on a do not call list. We're talking about analyzing the entire moment when an officer comes into contact with a civilian. What is the history of this officer? What are the demographics of the individual that has been stopped or charged? What is the basis of the evidence? What happens next? all of this information will be detailed and made available to the public. So again, we're partnering with the public to ensure transparency and accountability for a real commitment towards justice. The third thing that we're going to do is immediately set up a sentencing review unit to make sure that we're not just focused on conviction integrity and undoing the damage, but making sure that those who have already been sentenced or under my administration would have never been sentenced, have those reviewed so that people don't have to spend another day incarcerated longer than they're required to. Now, for me, the most important thing in ensuring that this vision comes to life is an advisory council, a collaborative group that are reflective of our community-based organizations, impacted community members, incarcerated, formerly incarcerated members, victims and accused alike, our public health professionals, our multi-faith community leaders. Why? Because when you talk about public safety, we're talking about the public stability. And that comes from our community leaders who are in the trenches every single day, see the need, see the struggle, and know how to respond to it. And instead of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars criminalizing people of color, looking the other way when the powerful and privileged commit these crimes with impunity, we're going to invest resources into our communities. I'm here to get into a long-term relationship with New Yorkers, to address root causes of crimes, to focus on rehabilitation and preventing recidivism. So we're ensuring an actual safe and just society for everyone, putting no bank account or badge above the law. I look forward to talking about more of my vision with all of you this evening. And again, it's really great to be in a space with friends and family tonight.
Thank you so much. And I would love to now hear from Alvin Bragg.
Thank you, Pastor Kaji, and to the rest of the clergy, great to be here this evening. Fighting racial discrimination has really been my life's work. My first interaction with a police officer was when I was 15 on my corner in Harlem on 139th Street and 7th Avenue. 3 white undercover police officers came upon me, put a gun inches from my face, falsely accused me of being a drug dealer, and shoved their hands in my pockets. That's how my relationship with the NYPD began. A young Black kid stopped for no other reason than being Black in a, quote, high crime neighborhood, which was my own corner. Those kind of stops were commonplace growing up, 3 of them at gunpoint. That's why I went to law school, to address this kind of militarized force, these racial disparities in mass incarceration. I practiced first as a civil rights lawyer and a criminal defense lawyer. First big case was suing the state police for excessive force against members of the Onondaga Nation. Then I became a federal prosecutor, where among other things, I prosecuted an FBI agent who lied and tried to intimidate Black and brown witnesses. Then I went to the New York State Attorney General's office, where I became ultimately the chief deputy and focused on leading our work on stop and frisk, showing that of all the stops, only 0.1% of them resulted in a conviction for a gun offense, which was the initial thesis, and leading our work on reentry, looking at investigating companies who were discriminating unlawfully based on criminal history, which obviously has a racial disparate impact. All of these life and work experiences lead me to a vision of the DA's office focused on ending racial disparities, focus on kind of 5 things. First, shrinking the system. More than 80% of our cases are misdemeanors and non-criminal offenses. We need to shrink our footprint. We look at the racial disparities there. This was in our stop and frisk report, showing how for those offenses, the racial disparities are so stark. So we need to start there. It's a human dignity issue for all, but we'll also address the racial disparities. The second is we need to track racial data. The Vera Institute did a report in 2015, documenting what we all know, but the data was very helpful, showing racial disparities at every step along the way, from plea offer to pre-resolution to sentencing. We need to track that data in real time and use it as a management tool and hold managers accountable and say, we can't have more than one standard of justice, one standard of justice for all. So I would use the data to make sure in real time we do not have racial disparities. The third is our hiring. I mean, I didn't go to the DA's office straight out of law school. You look at it, it is woefully non-diverse, from the early entrants to the senior staff. And in order to change the way the office works, we need to change who's in the office. And so I had a strategy at the Attorney General's office focused on hiring the whole person, not looking just at the school or the writing, but looking at things like, for me, example, if I were applying, I'm a Harlem Little League coach, and a Sunday school teacher. Those are things we need to be factoring in our hiring and also in our engagement, how you're engaging with community groups. Two more, conviction review. I had the honor of being on the Right to Remain Silent event earlier, where I saw Dr. Yusef Salaam. And I think about the fact that the Manhattan DA's office still has not looked back at all the tentacles of the exonerated Fives case. And we need to do that. And I've opined and written on that. And fifth, reentry. We have people who are in prison now and are coming home, and we need to address the racial disparities there. I know these issues firsthand on reentry. I've had a loved one live on my couch for a year after he was incarcerated in solitary confinement, and seeing the racial disparities play out in terms of police accountability. I've lived those as well. And we need to do these steps that I've laid out, because without them, we cannot have true public safety. I'll close by saying those early stops did not make me safer. It did not make my community safer, because in addition to being stopped by the police 3 times at gunpoint, I had a gun pointed at me 3 times by people who weren't police, had a knife at my throat, and had a homicide victim on my doorstep. So those steps don't work. We need community-based prevention on the front side and community-based public safety resolutions focused on our groups like our clergy and other faith groups.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn now to Thomas Edwards. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for having me. Very impressive group. I wanted to ask you about the Right to Be Silent campaign that's on in New York City. You know, growing up in New York City, you know, as you spoke, Mr. Briggs, I also had encounters with the police, and they often intimidate and kind of scare young people into making them confessions. And you mentioned the Central Park case. Without certain tactics that the police use today, it would make it a lot harder to get convictions. Would that be an issue to any of you? Would it matter? Because a lot of times in the DA's office, it seems it's more about winning as opposed to finding real justice, or even finding some where everybody is satisfied with the outcome. So would that be an issue to you?
Sorry, let me just break in, and thank you, Mr. Edwards, for that question. I had some confusion. There are a number of people running for things, and it's hard to know how many. And I thought we were still in the candidate section. So forgive me. I want to give you the chance to ask this important question. So this is my bad, not yours.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm
I
sorry.
apologize.
Yeah, we'll come back to you, and we want to hear that. So sorry. Diana, Florence, we would love to hear from you. And we will come back to you. And I promise that question you just asked will be answered.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, especially on a multi-faith forum. I like to think that I am the personification of a multi-faith forum. I am Jewish on my father's side. I am Sicilian Catholic on my mother's side, and I married an Episcopalian who is on the vestry of St. George's, Calvary St. George's in Gramercy, Stuyvesant Square. So I check almost all the boxes here in New York, not all, but that sort of upbringing has really informed my life's work, which is being a public servant. Many years ago, when I was thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, I thought about whether I wanted to be a public defender or a prosecutor. And I really thought I would be a public defender. I'm blessed to speak Spanish. And while I was in law school, I was in a public defense clinic. And for a year, I worked side by side with day laborers in North Carolina, where I was in law school. I represented all of them because they didn't provide interpreters down there. But what changed me and ultimately led me to the Manhattan DA's office 25 years ago was the fact that no matter how innocent my client was, I found, no matter how smart an argument I could think of or sharp a case that I could find that was on point, at the end of the day, I saw that the person that had the most power, had the quickest way to do justice in the process was the prosecutor. If you had a prosecutor with a heart, you could get a good result. If that wasn't the case, it could be catastrophic. So that's what led me to the Manhattan DA's office 25 years ago, where I spent my first 5 years working side by side with the victims of terrible racial domestic violence. And working with those survivors and their children, we crafted dispositions that were survivor-centered, even though we didn't know that term back then. And that's really informed my work. And I bring that up here in answer to this question, because I want to tell a story that really reflects the racism in our system that isn't in the same old way that we think about it. You know, it's very easy to point to stop and frisk or racial profiling, or even the horrible police abuses that we've seen go viral time and time again. But a more subtle form of racism that happens is when cases are undercharged. And this is the story, and I'm going to change the names, of course, of Roberta. And Roberta was attacked with the backside of a hammer by her husband in front of her two little girls. And when the case came in, I was a young assistant. It came in as a low-level assault, perhaps because they were Black, perhaps because they lived in public housing. You know, and it struck me immediately that this was absurd, that she had a head injury, that she'd lost consciousness, and that we needed to charge this the way it should be. And so that's what I did alongside working with Roberta and her girls. Every Friday, they came in and we worked together to figure out the best way forward for this family. And I'm proud to tell you, along the way, I got to learn so much from Roberta and her girls. I got drawings. I still have my box of 64 crayons from the mid-90s that those girls made pictures for me. And ultimately what it meant, though, is working together, we decided that the best way was for her to testify against her abuser. And in the end, when he saw that she was ready to go, he took the, you know, the high road, and he pleaded guilty. And, you know, that was something that was empowering, not just for Roberta, but for me as well. Because I saw that, you know, when you take cases individually and you make sure that you do what's right, not just for the survivor, but for the entire family, for the accused as well, you can have ripple effects for that family and for anyone who's involved in it. And all these years later, I'm still in touch with those girls. Unfortunately, Roberta's since passed away. And that, you know, experience in the criminal justice system, which could have been, you know, life-altering and traumatic in a way that would disrupt them, ultimately resulted in something positive. That is why I'm running. And that is what I aim to do as your DA. And so when we talk about the racism in our system, it, number one, starts with us saying, yes, there is racism. And yes, the prosecutors have had an integral role in that. But it's not simply saying it and moving on. This is not confession and we're not getting absolution. Absolution to me comes in actually doing the work. And the work to me is about reframing the office. I know that office back and forth because I did the work there. And what that meant is that for many years, the office has lived in suspended animation. Robert Morgenthau 45 years ago came into office and changed the office from head to toe. And that was revolutionary for its time, but it is long past its expiration date. And we need to be restructuring the office to reflect what we know to be true in 2021, which is that for too long, the criminal justice system has been used as a blunt, not surgical instrument. And it has over-criminalized certain groups while giving a pass to the rich and powerful. And I know this because I did this work from the inside. I prosecuted big companies that stole millions of dollars from workers and defrauded taxpayers out of hundreds of millions of dollars. I went after companies that endangered workers, that stole from tenants. And I understand that when we do those type of cases and go after Wall Street, the people that, you know, during 9 to 5 during the day, do whatever they want, commit crimes, and try to absolve themselves through charity on the weekends at big galas, that is wrong. And we need to change the calculus. The reason that corruption thrives is because it has been unchecked, and the enforcement, when it happens, is inconsistent. So my vision for the office, my vision for decarceration and removing racism once and for all from the system, is refocusing the office on crimes of power. Those are some of the crimes I've just mentioned: wage theft, health and safety violations, landlord-tenant fraud, sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, and of course, police accountability. Because when we do that, when we put the vast majority of our resources towards those types of crimes, not only are we going to get justice in those individual cases, We are going to recover those stolen tax monies for the very people that have been overly harmed by the criminal justice system. We'll be able to reinvigorate our housing, our schools, our public transport, and our health systems. I believe when it comes to crimes of poverty, it's not about simply making a list and saying we're not going to prosecute. It's about looking at the whys, finding out what happened in each case, and if it is not properly, it shouldn't be handled criminally, or it certainly shouldn't be handled with incarceration, we need to do that. And it's not simply about leaving it up to the individual prosecutor, because that is not going to be going to breed confidence. We need to earn back the confidence of frankly, New Yorkers and the entire country. And that starts with being transparent. It starts with being individualized and seeing what cases are what. And when we have someone who continually is being arrested for using drugs on the corner, that we don't simply cycle them through Rikers and repeat. We know that doesn't work. And we can use that money that we recover from these massive corruption cases to fund these treatment programs, to fund the community-based organizations that can help us ultimately solve these problems that for too long we've been using the criminal justice system to mask. Until we do that, until we really acknowledge our part in the harm and use our immense power of the prosecutor to actually right these wrongs, then we are going to repeat the same cycle. And I'll end with this. It is about having someone in that role who understands the system, understands where it's gone wrong, and understands how to do it right. I have done that. I have, from the inside, even when it was hard, even when it was toxic, even when I was unpopular, I made sure that the criminal justice system championed the everyday New Yorker, and it's what I'll do as your DA. Thank you.
Thank you. And I apologize to everybody when I'm trying to cut in with my heating system, New York City heating system that just is awful. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's just terrible. So anyway, but at least I have heat, and what a privilege. I want to acknowledge that we do have today all 8 acknowledged candidates on the call. And I just want to thank you all for showing up and for being willing to talk to our multi-faith community here. It really means a lot to us, because I do think we have a particular perspective, and continue to encourage you all to think about that. I also want to acknowledge our partner who's here from the Interfaith Center of New York, Chloe Breyer, and everybody who's working with her. It's just all these alliances have brought people to pay attention tonight, right now, and also maybe it's bedtime, so they're going to listen in to the recording. So thank you very much for being here. And I'm going to now kick to Eliza Orlins. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. And if you hear my radiator banging, trust me, I understand the New York heating situation in an old building. Well, I'm so grateful to be here tonight with all of you. And, I know that faith-based organizations here in New York, especially and including all of yours, have been some of the strongest champions for social justice issues and in our city. And so I'm so grateful for the work that you all do, and so happy to be here with all of you. As someone who grew up Jewish, the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, it was instilled in me at a very young age that tikkun olam was a big part of my life. It was, your obligation is to repair the world, is to leave it better than you found it. And so that's something that has resonated with me throughout my life, and probably a large reason why I became a public defender. I decided to become a public defender. It was the only thing I wanted to do with my life. It was the reason I went to law school, and the only job I applied for. When I talk to law students, I tell them, but don't do that. Apply to more than one job. And I've spent my entire career as a public defender, representing thousands of people here in Manhattan who have been charged with crimes who couldn't afford to hire an attorney. And so this initial question that you started off with about racism and mass incarceration is something I have seen firsthand every single day of my career, fighting in the trenches for the human beings charged with crimes in the city. And I remember almost a dozen years ago when I first became a public defender, I met a man who was an assistant manager at Gristedes in Lower Manhattan, and he'd worked at the same grocery store for 25 years, made his way up to assistant manager. And one night he was closing up the store. It was around 11 o'clock at night. He bought 2 bags of groceries with his employee discount to bring home to his family. And he left the store, he locked up, and he walked over to the A train. And he got on the train, uncrowded subway car, put his groceries on the seats next to him, and prepared for his long ride home uptown. At the 125th Street stop, 2 uniformed NYPD officers got on the train, grabbed his groceries, dumped them to the ground, and placed him in handcuffs and took him to jail for the night for the crime of occupying multiple seats on a transit facility. And the Manhattan District Attorney's Office had the opportunity to decline to prosecute that case, but they wrote that case up in ECAB, in the Early Case Assessment Bureau, and they decided to prosecute that man and keep him in jail for the night for taking up 2 seats on the train. And so the heartbreak and frustration and anger I felt at this system, at the way in which it is just rigged. You know, you'll hear people say, our criminal justice system is broken, but it's not broken. It's rigged. It's operating exactly as designed, and it's disenfranchising the very people it was designed to disenfranchise. And that's predominantly the people like the people I represent. You know, Black and brown folks, lower income folks, people who are LGBTQIA, people with disabilities. And in the almost dozen years I've spent representing the human beings of this city, you know, who are mothers and fathers, who are people's children, who are people's sons and daughters, who couldn't afford to hire an attorney, I realized that we can't change this system unless we change the DA, because for far too long, prosecutors have operated with impunity. They've violated human rights and human dignity. They've shown no care for people. They've not believed in the way in which rehabilitation and restorative justice can actually work. And that's what public defenders do. That's what we fight for every single day of our career. And that's the commitment I've made. And I've demonstrated that commitment by acknowledging these issues and working every day of my career to fix them. So to follow your instructions, Pastor Kaji, to get into specific policies, you know, I've put out a conviction review unit that is unlike any other. It's revolutionary. It's groundbreaking. I'd encourage everyone to check out the full plan on ElizaOrlins.com. But basically, you know, a conservative estimate for wrongful convictions, conservative, is 5 to 7%. Now, assuming that, that's still absolutely horrifying, but we think it is at least double that and could be as close up to 40% of convictions are wrongful. And these disproportionately affect marginalized communities, and the Manhattan DA's office has a responsibility to eliminate these mistakes before they happen, not just try to repair the damage years or decades after families and lives have been destroyed. So my conviction review unit will proactively find these cases before they become cold cases, work in coordination and release data, be completely transparent, ensure oversight, and also create several new units, but police accountability is incredibly important. And then of course, declining to prosecute clients like my client who worked at the Gristedes, declining to prosecute those cases before they come through the system. You know, I have a decline to prosecute policy where, you know, I've really laid out the reasons why it not only will keep our communities safer, but will create a more equitable, just, and safe New York to decline to prosecute the overwhelming majority of misdemeanors, to default to alternatives to incarceration when cases do get prosecuted, and to almost never ask for pretrial detention, because wealth-based detention, money bail must end, and it must end now. And there's no time to waste in thinking about these reforms that are so long overdue. You know, every day, people's lives are destroyed. I mean, so many people have talked about the family separation policy that Donald Trump had at our southern border. But the fact of the matter is, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office has a family separation policy, and it's happening in your backyard with your tax dollars. So the next district attorney needs to be someone who understands the implications of her policies in the real world and has the authentic commitment and experience to transform the system to make these bold systemic changes that are so desperately overdue. I am that person. I can do those things. And I'm so grateful to be here tonight for this conversation with all of you.
Thank you so very much. And I'm honored. Last but not least, I used to be an S, now I'm a D in terms of last name. So Tali, we're grateful you're here, and sorry you go last, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
No, actually, being Farhadian Weinstein, it's always unpredictable if I'm going to go toward the beginning or toward the end. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you, Pastor Kaji, to your colleagues in the clergy, to all of the lay leaders here and the people of faith, and to my colleagues in this race. And I should say to Mr. Edwards, for now I am last, but it's actually not too late to enter the race for Manhattan District Attorney. And we're obviously going for a more is merrier approach. So maybe by the end of the night, you'll want to join us. Pastor Kaji, the answer to your question is really rooted in my own experience with law enforcement as a child. And I'm going to introduce myself to you by starting there. 40 years ago, my family and I arrived in this country at JFK Airport with the few suitcases we had in our hands. Having left Iran, my father had come a few months ahead of us to get his bearings. And on that night, it was my mother, my little brother, and me. And it happened to be Christmas Eve, probably because tickets were cheapest on Christmas Eve. But what it meant for this Jewish girl from a Muslim country is that we experienced in that moment what felt like a Christmas miracle. My mother had in her hand fake tourist visas, we now understand, and one-way tickets, and asserted that we were tourists. And the first American I ever met was a law enforcement officer, what they used to call an INS officer, who absolutely had the power and authority to turn us around and to deport us on the spot. And instead, he said to my mother, you know, it's Christmas and the children have not seen their father in months. I'm going to give you permission, though not authorization, to enter the country, and you can collect yourselves and you can come back to self-deport. And the decision that he made in that moment is really what allowed for all of the blessings in my life. It allowed us to find quickly pro bono counsel and to learn how to make our claim for asylum, and ultimately a decade later to get amnesty and to become American citizens. And of course, it wasn't just a Christmas miracle. It was, I think, American law enforcement at its very best, which is law enforcement that uses its discretion in service of justice, safety, keeping families together, and that is motivated by compassion and humanity always. And I have tried in my career to emulate the example of that man whose name I don't know, but who was really, as I said, responsible for my life. And, you know, I think that discretion is how we answer the questions that you posed and so many others, because when I think about the way to reduce unjust and mass incarceration, I think that it means using our power and our authority to pull back from the cases that do not advance public safety and that perpetuate injustice, including racial disparities, and instead to use our power to bring the cases that really do matter, to stand with people who are vulnerable, victims of gun violence, victims of gender-based violence, people who are not safe in their home, in their street, at work, when they encounter the police, when they need the police. And, you know, I think many of us here are shaped by our faith. To me, this is also an idea that I draw out of my faith. In the Jewish tradition, we give lots of reasons for why Jerusalem was destroyed, which is, you know, a stand-in for why a civilization might fall apart. And one of them in the Talmud is, the answer is given that the community followed the law really strictly. They did not go beyond or inside the letter of the law. They did not use their discretion to bring their humanity, their judgment, their sense of justice to law enforcement. They were overzealous, they were over strict. And I keep that with me as well. I have worked across American legal institutions, from federal prosecution to local prosecution, from the front office of the US Department of Justice with Eric Holder to the front office of the Brooklyn DA's office, where I was part of the management team and leadership team. And I think that in order to really reduce incarceration and to achieve the kind of justice that you're asking us about, we have to think about both the front end and the back end of the criminal justice system. And we did a lot of this work in Brooklyn. So at the front end, first of all, living the principle that incarceration is a last resort, we in Brooklyn, I am proud to say, voluntarily reduced our pre-trial detention population by 80%. We sent the smallest number of people to Rikers than any of the boroughs and anywhere in the state per capita to jail, simply by retraining our ADAs to think about bail and detention differently. I bring that with me. We also looked for off-ramps wherever we could. So even if a person was being prosecuted, could they go immediately or at some other reasonable time along the way into a diversion program? And we created diversion programs for people struggling with chemical addictions, for people struggling with mental health issues, a diversion program for gun possession, really trying to be creative and productive in every way to say, how can we safely take people out of the criminal justice system? And then, Pastor, I've heard a bit about this from my colleagues tonight. I think that we'll never be able to answer your question if we don't also think about the back end, the people who are already incarcerated. And I'm proud that in Brooklyn, I built the first post-conviction Justice Bureau in the country in order to take on this very question. One component of it was the Conviction Review Unit that DA Thompson and DA Gonzalez started, and I had the privilege of inheriting and supervising. We're still the premier, most productive conviction review unit in the country, voluntarily going back and doing the work to find the wrongfully convicted. But it was also important to us to think about the people who were rightfully convicted, right? In the sense that they had committed the underlying crime, but their continuing incarceration was unjust. And so we created programs to support clemency, to support parole, to support excessive sentencing claims, to support legislation to make excessive sentencing claims easier, to support sealing and expunging past convictions, and to say we also have a role in reentry and making sure that people can safely return to their communities. And I would bring all of that experience to Manhattan as well. I want to say just one last thing about disparities. And I think that it's going to be throughout our conversation, but I want to put on the table just one ethic, which is that we have to be transparent about the past, about the present, and about the future if we are going to get to disparities. So one of the things that we took the time to do, my team in the Conviction Review Unit, was to publish a report. It took us a year to do this project with the Innocence Project on all of the exonerations that had come until then, to say, this is what happened. This is where prosecutors and police, defense counsel, courts went wrong and robbed people of these years in their lives. And 24 out of the 25 people in that set were people of color. It also means that in the present, we have to publish, and we have the capacity and the data to do this, disaggregated information about everyone who we are touching, race and gender and other characteristics of defendants, of witnesses, of victims, to really see that we are treating like cases alike, really abiding by that principle. And the future, we have to be clear about what our policies are, what our plea policies are, what our charging policies are, so that people can have a look into what used to be the black box of prosecution. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And, my Manhattan radiators are coming for you with the timer. So we are joined now by our final candidate, Lucy Lang. And the question that all the other people on the line are responding to, I would pose to you, and also just, respectfully understand that you may not know just off the top of your head, which is, what will you do to reduce mass incarceration and racism more generally in the criminal justice system?
Thank you so much, Pastor. Thank you all for having me tonight. I'm Lucy
And
Lang.
I just want to warn you, Ms. Lang, my radiators will come for you if you go too long.
After how many minutes, Pastor?
5.
All right, perfect. I'll keep it at 4.5. That question is, in many ways, the most important question that the next district attorney has to answer. And I intend to do it in the following ways. First, by incorporating a definitive racial justice policy, and that has been on my website for months. It lays out very clearly the ways that I intend to shrink the footprint of the criminal justice system. That means not prosecuting cases that don't belong in the system at all. It means creating pathways to other systems for people who need supportive services, including people who are suffering from substance misuse and from mental health challenges. I've been really honored to work alongside a group of interfaith advisors to my campaign in creating a set of plans. And in the early days of the campaign, when we were talking, it became clear that all of these leaders from different faith groups had been to visit a congregant in prison. And yet none of them necessarily knew that the others had done the same. It really illuminated for me the extent to which faith leaders are really picking up so much of the damage that's being wrought by the criminal justice system. So the additional piece on top of decriminalizing where we can and diverting into other systems where we can is to end the reliance on these unconscionable mandatory minimums, on New York's 3 strikes laws, and on the kinds of extreme punitive laws that have resulted in excessive incarceration statewide and in fact across the country. We also know that these numbers have baked into them outrageous racial disparities. And the way to go about addressing them is by shrinking overall, but also by looking at what the data says about where these disparities are happening. An evaluation that we undertook when I was an assistant district attorney in Manhattan in partnership with the Vera Institute assessed every different stage of the criminal justice practice and looked at whether there were racial disparities at different areas. And what it concluded was that the largest disparity was with respect to whether or not someone was indicted. That in Manhattan, you were far more likely to have your case presented to a grand jury and be indicted if you were a person of color than if you were a white person. And what that enables an office to do is to create tailored interventions to the places where disparities are occurring, rather than simply throwing things at the wall and hoping that they stick. And I intend to bring a strategic approach to addressing racial disparity. But that also means diversifying the workforce, building a workforce that is mission aligned and that looks like the city that we all hope to serve. It means incorporating the voices of people who are directly impacted. And I'm proud to have created a first of its kind college and prison course that brings assistant district attorneys inside New York State prisons that I have taught in a number of New York State prisons over the past several years, and have worked alongside incarcerated New Yorkers to build ideas for change, and then have worked alongside them when they've come home to our communities. And I have seen time and time again the ways in which all of the systems that should be supporting people coming home tend to fail them. And I've seen how very often faith leaders have to pick up the pieces and try to solve that. And that's why I'll prioritize reentry supports for people coming home. And I'm committed to having an advisory council of directly impacted New Yorkers as district attorney, just like I do now on the campaign, to help inform policy every step of the way, because there is nothing more important that the next district attorney can do than dismantle mass incarceration and address racial disparities across the system, but especially with respect to decision-making in the district attorney's office.
Well, thank you. I feel really full listening to all of you with your sincerity and care. And so long as you're willing to take the phone call where you're like, WTF, why are you going after people who we care about in our communities? You know, I think there's something really fruitful that's coming from this conversation. So we're gonna now transition. And what we would love to know is some responses to questions in the remaining time, and we have about a half hour for that. Some questions that come from people. So put your questions into the Q&A. And we already had one question, and actually 2. And the first one I accidentally invited early, but it just gave you a chance to think about it. So I'm gonna go back to Mr. Edwards, who was incarcerated for 20 years, who has deep understanding of our carceral system. And we're gonna hear from him. And wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever questions you have for the next Manhattan DA, please put them in the Q&A, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. And thank you, Mr. Edwards.
Thank you for having me. I was actually incarcerated 21 years and 2 days.
21 years and 2 days. I'm so sorry. I'm not taking one moment away from you.
2 days was because the paperwork wasn't done on time. So I spent an extra 2 days in prison. That's what happens, in our system. But my really question is, I mean, all you sound so great, sincere, and, the disparities in arrests and convictions and all that. You all know the problems, and some of you have even lived them. But my question is that the tactics that the police use and even the DA's office result in convictions. And convictions is what win offices here. And when you look at the right to remain silent for 16 and 17-year-olds, it would change a lot of convictions if that came through, where they didn't have to talk to the police about anything. How do you feel about that? And this question is open to any of you running.
Well, I can kick off and take the lead for everyone. Thomas, I think that's an extremely important question, because the introduction of a civilian to the system is through law enforcement. It's one of the reasons why I have dedicated my career to holding law enforcement accountable and changing abusive policies and practice that do exactly that. Early today, I was part of a press conference hosted by youth in support of the Right to Remain Silent Act, which is going to ensure that youth have counsel during any encounters with police. And as someone like I was saying earlier, I represent children in suspension hearings. That means talking about the Fifth Amendment, the rules of evidence, and trials to elementary school kids and junior high school and high school kids. And that's not what they should be learning in schools. And so I think it's important to hold law enforcement accountable. And for me, I've put out a policy, a thorough policy, not only about police accountability, but transparency. Let's dissect that relationship the moment when an officer comes into contact with the civilian and presents them to the system. And before the district attorney makes the decision of who to charge, what to charge, or what penalty, if any, to recommend down the line, let's understand exactly how this happened. What is the history of this officer? And if it's problematic, to ensure that they are terminated or disciplined and are no longer on the force. And that extends to prosecutorial misconduct. A lot of wrongful convictions, it's involved with faulty witnesses, police misconduct, but there's also prosecutor misconduct. And we can't overlook that. And so I'm also committed to holding prosecutors accountable that cover for bad policing to secure these unnecessary and sometimes faulty convictions at the outset. And I think that's going to be imperative before we talk about programs and other things, to start right where it happens in the arrest review unit, what is now the Early Case Assessment Bureau.
Thank you so much. And I do want to hear some, and I know everybody wants to hear some answers, and we're not going to cut that off, but there's a question in the chat that I think is actually pretty fundamental, and it is hold on, I want to read it exactly as they put it in the Q&A. What exactly does the Manhattan DA do? So can y'all answer that?
That's a great question.
And I hope we can all answer that. I sure hope so.
No, but I think it's actually, what it really comes down to is, do people really understand what the DA can do? And, fundamentally what they're supposed to be doing is enforcing the criminal laws of the state of New York on behalf of the people of the state of New York. But what that means is not enforcing every violation of the law. There is something called discretion. The problem has been, though, the discretion has always gone in one direction. It's gone towards the powerful and away from, and the default has been away from low income and people of color. So the reality is the Manhattan DA, in some ways, when you elect your DA, you can change the world, because if you have the right person in leadership, the way they wield that discretion, where they use it to make things fairer, to make sure that people are held accountable no matter who they are, where they were born, how much money they have, or what zip code they have, then you can actually create trust in our government. That's what the Manhattan DA is supposed to do. And the way they do it is through the cases they select and the cases that they they don't select. And what we've seen for too long, and I know this because I worked there for 25 years, we've seen for too long as the resources have been overly allocated towards one type of crime, whereas the more powerful have gotten a pass. We need to change that calculus. So that's what the DA can do. And when you do that, whether it's the president of the United States or someone on your corner, when we do that, we all believe that the law applies to all of us, and we're going to all feel safer and have better trust in our government.
Yeah, others.
So I don't think that was a sentence or two, Diana. They asked for a sentence or two as to what the DA does.
I'm a lawyer. I don't.
I'm just kidding.
I mean, I think
I can briefly summarize. So essentially, what the district attorney does is makes all prosecuting decisions right here in Manhattan. So makes decisions as to who gets charged, what crimes get charged, what offers are made, what sentences are requested, whether or not pretrial detention is requested, whether cash bail gets set, et cetera. And so that's the person who makes all of those decisions. So, and that's my definition. I think I stuck to two sentences, but I will say that the district attorney has been the primary driver of mass incarceration of people of color. And I know that's something we were already talking about. And I wanted to, also speak to what Mr. Edwards said. And I'm so sorry for the 21 years and 2 days. It's just unbelievable that we could even be a country that seeks sentences that long. It's absolutely despicable. And the thing that you said that really struck me is you asked how we would measure success, because convictions have always been the measure of success. And that is absolutely true. And, the fact that the language has even changed that much means the way that we're even talking about this, the fact that the things that I've said my entire career as a public defender are now being parroted by people across this race and across this country. And it's so exciting because it means that people are ready to see a DA who is not just going to be seeking convictions as a measure of success, but maybe using completely different metrics, which is what I want to do, which is if we successfully don't ever see a person walk through the doors of 100 Center Street ever again, that is what success should look like. If we exonerate people, it should be the number of cases that we're able to get rid of from our criminal legal system. That should be how we're measuring success. And I think that people are ready for that conversation.
I have a little bit of a different point of view than my other 7 candidates, and I look at it through a view of public safety. So yes, the job of the district attorney's office is to prosecute cases and to investigate cases and to handle them fairly and accurately. But we're also tasked with providing the people of Manhattan public safety. And public safety starts with prosecution. It does not necessarily mean incarceration, but it means holding people accountable. We need to keep New York City safe, and we need everyone to feel safe here. That is how in the past.
Whoa. Sorry, I'm gonna pause here, because I actually don't believe that just because we say it has always been that it's been public safety for all New Yorkers. And is the public safety that you're talking about, which usually was for white neighbors of mine, the same as weighed by how you would be prosecuted, you would be arrested, you would be anything. No, I do not believe. Nobody believes. Nobody on this call believes in our communities that public safety was about everybody's public safety. It was about some people's public safety. And one of the things that we're talking about on this call is how we make public safety actually encompass everybody. So I'm not saying you're not saying that. I'm saying I haven't heard in your naming and claiming of this. I didn't see it in the initial part of that, and you have like a couple seconds to fix that.
Well, yeah, in the initial part of it, I thought we were going to be kept to 5 minutes, and I didn't.
No, it's not about 5 minutes or whatever.
No,
it's
no,
about,
but
wait and see.
I do think that you have to look at it all encompassing. And I think I go out into all different neighborhoods in Manhattan, across the borough, and I think everyone wants to feel safe in their neighborhood. And I understand intrinsically that how people feel safe in their neighborhoods is different from neighborhood to neighborhood. I understand intrinsically that some people, when they see the police, they don't feel safe. that is a problem. And I fully acknowledge that and understand that. That is not what I'm saying, but I do believe that there has to be a balance between over-policing and under-policing, because in every neighborhood across these boroughs and in Manhattan, everyone wants to be able to feel safe. Everyone wants to go to work on the train and come home on the train. They want their kids to go to the playground. They want to go to the store and not be hassled. This does not know a zip code. This is every zip code. This is every neighborhood. And that is what I'm talking about, is that public safety is for everyone and that it means different things. You have to go out into the community.
Public safety has been entirely defined for white people in New York City. How do we redefine it? And if you don't see it, like, go ahead and defend that, but like you're up against 7 other people, and hopefully they wouldn't ever let any of us uphold that idea.
Well, can I jump in here, Pastor Kaji? Because I think the other part that's important to identify that what district attorneys do is they set policies. Most of us here are trial attorneys, but the district attorney, their views, their experiences, their past positions, their presence in our communities, their personal experiences are what going to drive the policies that we create. And we have to face the fact that the racial disparities are not by accident. We know these systems were created to target communities of color. And that's really why communities of color have been the face of crime in the city, and the powerful and privileged have done whatever they want with impunity. And so if we're going to be serious about changing things, we have to acknowledge that it starts with policing, right? And how our communities are policed. I mean, if you look at these safest neighborhoods, not just in Manhattan, but across this country, you won't see obnoxious police presence. You won't see floodlights blasting into people's apartments. You just don't see it. You don't see metal detectors in their schools. What you see are resources, homeownership, employment rates, mental health programs. That's the respect that we need to bring to all communities regardless of race or income. And that's why the decline and prosecute list that I put forward is so important, because I see how these charges are used to justify invasions into our privacy, into our homes, into our persons. I see how these charges relegate this office to debt collectors for the court system and the state at the expenses of our hardworking families, how it cuts immigrants, those documented or not documented, out of the system, those who want to seek help but can't because they're afraid of revenge, or those who want to hold their employers accountable for things like wage theft and unsafe working conditions. And so what we really need to do is tear open this hero public safety idea for the DA's office and really understand that what we're doing is destabilizing communities of color. And so it's our obligation to ensure stability. And that comes through resources, as much resources as possible, restorative justice, alternatives to incarceration, because we're not going to have public safety without public stability. And that means all of our families across this city.
Pastor Kaji, can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Bragg.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of put a face. I agree with what Tahani said, and just very specifically, you know, I think about growing up, and my dad ran homeless shelters, and my mom was an educator, and in my neighborhood, they were two of the people that made everyone feel safe. Right, I couldn't walk more than a block and a half without a former student of my mom saying thank you for educating me, and I got this opportunity and these opportunities for my family, or my dad talking to an unsheltered person who he referred to as his clients, and them saying, you know, I'll see you tonight, Mr. Bragg. They made us feel safer in my community. And notwithstanding, you know, the kind of quote safety and the militarized police presence in my neighborhood, I still had the experiences I talked about, you know, with a semi-automatic weapon put to my head, a knife at my throat, and a homicide victim on my steps. That's with the police on the corner guarding themselves. So, but I want to go back to what Mr. Edwards said, just because, and I know Tahani was there and Eliza was there. The program earlier, the Right to Remain Silent program, was just profound. And Mr. Edwards' question, you know, was talking about, you know, our youth. And for me, really, you know, that's where this starts. I mean, I talk about my childhood because that was so formative. We're talking about the sort of interrogation of our youth. And this comes up. I mean, this is not 1980s New York. This is, you know, right now, today. I mean, I teach the high school Sunday school class at my church, and I've been teaching it for about, well, I used to teach 7th and 8th grade, then my daughter got to 7th and 8th grade, and I had to switch to high school because she didn't want me to teach her. But I've been teaching Sunday school for about 15 years total. And I would say almost every year that I teach the high school class, we have a sort of a justice-involved matter to address. And so these issues are alive and well in 2021 New York. And the issue of truth-telling by police, which was at the heart of the right to remain silent, is alive and well. I mentioned I've prosecuted an FBI agent for lying who was intimidating Black and brown witnesses. I've got the honor of representing Ms. Carr, Eric Garner's mother. At the heart of that case is an officer who was at the scene when Mr. Garner was choked to death. That officer went back to his precinct and filled out a arrest report and said that no force was used in arresting Mr. Garner. A bold-faced lie. He didn't know there was going to be a video. But in 2021, with a mayor who is applauding action in Minneapolis and letting go of those officers, this officer who lied on that report is still on the force. So we need to protect our youth and the right to remain silent. But then more broadly, we've got to police this space of honesty. Without honesty by those entrusted to keep us safe, our system doesn't work.
Thank you. And so here I'm going to pause for just a moment because I'm seeing some comments in the chat, and folks are asking, I'm pushing, Pastor Kaji, Black woman Kaji, is pushing people on some stuff and saying that I'm favoring candidates. And I think every candidate who's in the room knows very clearly that I do not favor any particular one of them. What I will do is I will ask some questions. So if you don't want me to ask them, like, maybe put your question in the comments, but don't critique when I'm pushing somebody. All right. So let's keep moving. All right. So with that said, we are seeing that there is unjust, disproportionate enforcement in communities of color. And the Manhattan DA is going to be able to do something pretty profound about that. And we really appreciate what you've said about what you will do to do that. And what I would love in the actual productive, helpful questions is people to ask some questions about this. Okay, so I'm going to read them. What are the plans you have for prison reform? Let's allocate 5 minutes to this, and please try not to take too much time. I don't know how we allocate that between 8 people.
If I may, Pastor,
Mm-hmm.
Having spent several years teaching in New York State's prisons, I am really attuned to the incredible dehumanizing nature of our prisons and the fact that we need wholesale prison reform. And I will be a vocal advocate for transforming incarceration in this country, which means limiting it to only the absolute outlier cases and ensuring that anyone who is deprived of their liberty, it's for a limited amount of time and under circumstances that don't dehumanize them and return them worse off. And I wanted to just to a bit of Mr. Edwards' point, I went to grab my penal law because I was thinking about the general purposes of the criminal law. Now, the Office of the District Attorney and Prosecutor are both defined separately in the criminal procedure law, but the penal law itself lays out general purposes. And interestingly enough, and we teach this in my class in New York's prisons, there is a provision that was added in 2006 that says that one of the purposes of the penal law is when people are incarcerated is to ensure the public safety by preventing the commission of offenses through the deterrent influence of sentences authorized, rehabilitation of those convicted, and the promotion of their successful and productive reentry and reintegration into society. And that is a new provision, the reentry piece, as of 2006. And when I tell you that I have taught it to prosecutors over many years, and most assistant district attorneys do not know that the purpose of the penal law includes the commitment to successful reintegration. So one area that the next district attorney must prioritize, and that I'm committed to prioritizing, is making sure that we support people when they come home, and that we are only only putting people in a position to have to come home in very, very limited circumstances.
Thank you. Go ahead, Tali.
Sure. If I may, Pastor, I'd like to answer that question by actually also answering another important question that I see in the chat, because there was a question there about parole. And of course, we can't directly reform the prison system. The district attorney does not run the prison system, but we are interconnected in that we have the power to send people to prison, and I think the power to help people get out of prison. And there was a really important question over there, and I know that this is a community that's engaged in advocating for legislation. It was about the Less is More Act, which I support, and I think many folks here do, which is about making sure that we're not sending people back into prison for technical violations, for violations that are not crimes. So if someone who was not on parole, committed that act, they would not be incarcerated. But I want to say that I think it's important to go back past the question of less is more and to think about more radically taking on people who are incarcerated and need not be, whose incarceration does not fulfill any public safety objective at all, because two reasons. First of all, New York has moved over time to a system where there's less parole, more determinate sentences. So parole reform is not going to get us to where we want to be and where the conversation has been tonight. And the other is that our sentences are often so long that the opportunity for parole comes along way too late. So I thought, in the spirit of the question about prison reform, I might share a story about a case that I worked on in Brooklyn that had a very big effect on me. And I share the gentleman's name with the permission of his daughter. His name is Derek Holland. And when I built the Post-Conviction Justice Bureau, we got an application from Mr. Holland saying that he had been incarcerated by that point for 25 years for having stolen $100 worth of stuff back in 1994 when he was addicted to crack cocaine. In the course of a week, he committed 3 robberies, and including in the $100, he had stolen a winter coat that he was caught wearing not far away from where he had taken it. And, he asked us to support his clemency application. He didn't get clemency. And then he asked us to support his parole application. And we did, which was very unusual for a district attorney's office. I changed our policy to be supportive of parole at the first opportunity. And he was paroled, but I don't think anybody felt like that was really justice. And so I think we need to go deeper into the lengths of sentences if we really are going to be able to achieve some of the things that we have talked about here tonight.
I'd like to also just jump in and I agree with what Tali said in regards to the Less is More Act. I'm honored and humbled to be endorsed by Akeem Browder, the brother of Khalif Browder. And one of the things about parole that makes it incredibly difficult is these technical parole violations serve as loopholes, and they trigger automatic incarceration for very basic things, not being in touch with your parole officer, not updating your address, sometimes not being gainfully employed. So although the intention or the idea is to help people successfully reintegrate or help people connect with resources in their communities, what it ends up being is essentially a field of landmines where a person, every wrong turn they make, or every time they simply struggle in ways that people who aren't interacting with the system are struggling on their own, are tripped up and are incarcerated. And they're incarcerated for indefinite periods of time until the system gets around to remembering they exist, holding a hearing, and then responding therefrom. So I think the important part of it is to diminish these loopholes and ensure that we're not setting people up to be tripped up and constantly being dragged back in the system. And so I was proud to also stand and sign on to the Less is More Act as well. And if we're going to talk about parole, we have to talk about it in a meaningful way, not in addition to sentences and ways to, again, keep people coming back into the system.
And Pastor, if I can add just something.
Sorry, I'm just gonna say for people who didn't have a chance.
That would.
So, Miss Quart.
Yeah. I know there are many questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and I think Ms. Williams had a question about social services. So maybe I'll take a shot at trying answering a new question. It's a very critical question about which sort of services we should provide and which we shouldn't. And I have some experience in this matter. I've done 3 years of criminal defense on the Design Council plan representing poor people in Manhattan criminal court. And we shouldn't oversell alternatives to incarceration diversion programs as some sort of panacea. They're not. The better program or the better result is to decline to prosecute a whole host of crimes, and then the office, through its social services, act with a liaison with the not-for-profit providers through the city budget, who actually do a much better job than the DA's office, without the footprint of the office or the top charge hovering above people. I know from firsthand experience representing people in criminal court that there are some good services like the Stop Lift program, but there also is a waste of services, quality of life programs, making poor immigrant workers come in for a half a day, take time off from work to do nonsense type classes and programming. I'm not going to put your tax dollars to fund that sort of programming. It's not worth anyone's time. And it's the punishment of poverty in a different way, even though it's a summons, not a criminal charge. Secondly, the question asks what type of programs do work. And I think there is a good model of what does work, specifically Talon Murphy and the West Harlem Initiative, responding to, unfortunately, a terrible situation in Central and West Harlem where under Cy Vance, 103 young men and kids were taken out of NYCHA complexes in Central and West Harlem. 5-6 years later, he responds, and I give Cy Vance some credit, with a policy of wraparound services, preventive services that essentially takes a 5-10 block radius called the West Harlem Initiative and looks at providing a restorative justice model, a place for young people to go. But it does something very specific, which is important. All the hires are from the neighborhood. All the hiring is done from impacted individuals from that 5-10 block radius. That's where I would spend my money on social services. That's where I would use social services. And it doesn't only have to be done in West Harlem. It could be done in Marble Hill. The Dykeman House is a couple blocks from where I grew up. Throughout Manhattan, where the same problems that have manifested in Central Harlem are certainly existing in different parts of Manhattan. That's an appropriate way to use social service to really get at the root causes of problems within our community, which is poverty.
I'd like to weigh in on the pre-entry question, and here's why. You know, Mr. Edwards brought up something, he talked about 16 and 17-year-olds. You know, a few years ago, the legislature passed Raise the Age. And that now gives discretion to DAs to prosecute people or not who are below 18. Here's the problem. That has led to chaos. There has not been clarity. We need to once and for all understand the science that, frankly, that people below 25 really don't have, you know, the mental capacity that someone that an adult has, and that we need to be treating youth crimes in a different way. My position is that crimes, with almost without exception, under 18 need to go to family court. But it's also in that 18 to 25 area, what we need to be doing is not spending more resources to create youth related crime bureaus in the office, but partnering actually with existing services. Family court is excellent at this. And there is no magic thing that happens when you turn 18. When you are 17 and 364 days, you are not that different when you are 18 years. And what we need to be doing is approaching crime based on science and facts. And so when we do that, we can actually look at what brings youth. Often it is poverty and lack of access to opportunities. And we can use the resources that we at the DA's office, through corruption prosecutions, we can take that money, not spend it on trips to Paris as the current DA did, but actually reinvesting in the very organizations that are within the community. There are many local organizations that do this work. And Mr. Quart brought up some. There's Street Corner Resources. There's so many. And when we do that, we work together. We actually stop that. I don't call it the school to prison pipeline. It's the poverty to prison pipeline. The final thing I'll just say about that, when we talk about reentry, whether someone goes into prison or not, if we're doing reentry when someone is coming out at 6 months or a year, we start to think about it, it's way too late. We need to be thinking about reentry from the start. And that means when someone is charged. I'm proud that I have 15 labor unions endorsing me. And one of the most incredible programs is Pathways to Apprenticeship. We can work with people when they are charged to get them to in alternative paths after they've been held accountable for their crimes. Get them into not just jobs, but careers, whether it's in construction or in the culinary arts or in so many other places. It is incumbent upon us, as some of my colleagues have said here tonight, about not simply just looking at what is in front of us and just punishing and being reactive, but thinking really holistically and proactively, so that if someone has found their way into the criminal justice system, that we can make this the very last time that they are there. But it needs, we can't do it alone. We have to work with community organizations, unions, and faith leaders like yourselves.
Thank you so much. And we're headed towards wrapping up. And what we're seeing, and I'm not cutting you off, I want to just like frame the last few minutes of this conversation. If y'all want to be on here for another few hours, fine. But you know, I'm gonna close this off for the next 5 minutes. And there have been some questions that I think we hope as voters within Manhattan that you're thinking about and really prayerfully considering. And I'm going to read a few. One is, what are your thoughts about the role of school safety agents within New York City schools? What alternatives can you imagine for how we maintain the security of our school buildings without making them a function of a police state? Especially as we consider that the majority of our public school students are Black and brown children, and how we enforce how all this works tends to come down even harder there. So that's the question that's in our chat. And then another question is, after years of connecting residents in our area north of 96th Street to the police, to reduce crime in our area, we had 6 murders in the past year. What paths do you suggest to lead towards violence reduction and removal of guns? So that's another question that's in the chat. And I'm not going to ask you within the next 3 minutes we have here, but what I would love to figure out within the last 3 minutes is that we have these, and then there will be other questions that now that we pose these, that others would ask. What's the best way to ask you so that we have a sense of who would be best representing our positions? I mean, do we need to come back for another one of these forums in a month? I'm not proposing that because this was a lot of work, but maybe.
Also, I have a suggestion. So, you know, I mean, listen, anyone is welcome to reach out to me directly. My email is eliza@elizaorlins.com. And I'm sure that my fellow candidates would be open to speaking with anyone who wanted to chat about these issues. But I think the most important thing is accountability. And that means that we are accountable to all of you. You are our constituents and our voters. And I think, you know, you have to just really think about, you know, what it means to elect a progressive district attorney, someone who's truly decarceral, and, you know, making our city safe. But also safety obviously means being free to exist in your community and have your needs met, and being able to do your job safely and have a family and have a business that prospers and not live in fear of being brutalized or assaulted. And that includes by the NYPD. So I think that we need to really be talking about these issues. And Pastor Kaji, I'm just so grateful for you. Thank you for being such a wonderful moderator and bringing all these issues up. And I know, you know, we've all been doing this for a long time, but this was a pretty unique discussion that really, I think, got to the heart of a lot of these issues. So thank you so much.
Pastor Kaji, I imagine I speak for everyone in saying that because we do these regularly, I'd be happy to share with you the next upcoming event. I have one on my calendar, I think for the 9th, but they're happening regularly. And so if you can circulate them to folks in your community who want to hear more from all of us when we'll all be assembled, we would certainly welcome you at any of these public forums. And I'm thrilled for people to reach out to me anytime at 917-630-7067.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you to everyone. And I also want to say thank you to Pastor Kaji. I want to thank you for pushing me. We obviously have some things to discuss. My email is lizcrotty2021@gmail.com. Pastor Kaji, I don't know if you want to give me yours, but we can do it in the chat. But I do appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone tonight. And I do appreciate having a spirited discussion about these issues because they are not one-sided. They are two-sided, three-sided, four-sided. And we need to have all of those discussions so that everyone gets fairness under the next DA. And I really appreciate being here tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yep. And I echo all of that as well. I'll put my contact information in the chat as well, but this is what it's about. We're all going to sound good. We're all going to look good, even after all this time campaigning. But the difference is going to be in our policies, and we should be hammered on our policies and our positions and make sure that you feel comfortable in whose hands you're putting the leadership of the Manhattan DA's offices in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Kaji. And of course, the differences are also in our experiences. And I really hope that this is just the beginning of the conversation with you and with the folks who are assembled here. I second Lucy's idea that you should just piggyback on all of the other fora that are scheduled. And of course, please feel free to reach out, talifw@taliforda.com. Thank you.
Yes, and thanks to everyone as well. And I don't want to repeat what everyone has already said. I'll just say there's so much more we could talk about. My vision comes from my experience, and I encourage all of you to visit my website and email me directly. I love to talk to people. This is what's been the hardest for me about the pandemic, is being stuck in my living room. So please email me and I'll go into the corner and email you back.
Thank you, Pastor Kaji, for organizing us. And I think, as Lucy said, the best idea is to let everyone know about forums coming up. And I can be reached just at my name, danquart.com. You can find me on my website, email me, and look forward to speaking with anyone about it.
Well, looks like
Did we lose Dan?
I think so. Dan?
You lost? Oh.
I'll go
We
ahead
got your website though, Dan.
All right.
I think it's danquart.com, everyone.
You're going out on a limb, huh? I'm at alvinbragg.com and Alvin at alvinbragg.com. Thank you, Pastor Kaji and the clergy for this discussion, and I appreciate it and look forward to many more between now and June 22nd.
And Lee Goldberg just put in the chat a reminder that the Jewish Coalition for Criminal Justice Reform is holding a forum on Tuesday, April 20th at 7 p.m. So hopefully you all can tune in for that.
Stay safe and healthy, everyone. Thank you, Pastor. And thanks to all the organizers.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all. And before you go, I just want to say this, actually, I don't know why anybody's talking about me. I just happened to be moderating this conversation, but this was a coalition of 20 different congregations. And also, I'm just really, really grateful for all the people who pulled together for this, who've been listening to you, who are trying to figure out how to vote, because it's not simple. And, you know, we're partners in discernment. And that's the crazy thing here, is like, most of the time with campaigns, people are asking us, can you sign up to endorse us? Can you, you know, as congregations, I don't really feel like that's appropriate, but can we be conversation partners about what's really important to our communities? And this forum represented that, and you showed up for that. So we're really, really grateful for that, and consider that to be the opening in a campaign season that is incredibly important to our city. And I don't want to close. I would actually love to close with our friend, Mr. Edwards, Thomas Edwards, who came here with some priorities, and I'd love for him to just remind us of what those are.
Yeah, I think it's great that you have this and give everyone an opportunity to present their positions and how they see justice, because I think it's important that New York has a different direction. You know, for the last 40 or 50 years in this city, has that always been oppression for people of color. And I think now things are changing. So, you know, I would like to have you speak more in different places. You know, basically, I want to invite whoever wants to talk and about this at different places. I work at Exodus at times. I'm part of J.C. Flowers Foundation with reentry, dealing with service support. And I would love to hear more from all the candidates. And I will definitely be in touch with you if you're interested and give you a platform to talk about this. And I would like to pair you with people who have actually been incarcerated and have dealt with some of these issues that you are preparing to, you know, readdress.
Thank you so
Thomas,
much.
How
Yeah.
do we get in touch with Thomas?
Yeah, no, exactly. So thank you so much. And we're over, but we're not over our mission. And the fact that each 8 of you has actually stood up to do something that's really rough, that's in front of other people, that gets attacked all the time. I mean, we just want to say we see you, we pray for you. We realize this is rough. I mean, honestly, it is rough. And however our congregations and the people within can support you, as long as you're not being terrible, we're here.
Have a wonderful evening. God bless. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.